I now invite David McCullough to come forward to light the chalice and lead us in our affirmation of covenant, which is in your order of service.
I light this chalice with these words by Lee Kivy. This chalice is for the living, the changing, the becoming. This chalice is for losing the script of your life, the chapters about who you are in other people's stories. This chalice is for the lost GPS that was supposed to show you how to get where they expected you to go. This chalice is for skipping the directions, coloring outside the lines, painting not by number, but by silence, by wild abandon, with a brush you made yourself from light deep inside. Startling, vivid, a new voice that already knows you. Finally, a true story. Please join me in the affirmation of covenant, which you will find in your order of service. Love is the doctrine of this church, the quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other.
As I am gradually learning more about Arkansas and its history, you have caught on by now that learning about history is one of my hobbies. One thing that stands out is how early the Presbyterians established themselves here and how often against the odds they nurtured leading local voices for progress and social justice. Many of you know that before this congregation was founded in the 1950s, there was a Universalist church here in Little Rock. Founded in 1895, it became a leading progressive religious voice in Little Rock before the First World War. It closed around 1920, and about 10 years later, the Unitarians came scouting, looking to see what prospects there were for starting a Unitarian church here. They decided that as long as the Reverend Dr. Hay Watson Smith was serving at Second Presbyterian Church, there was no hope. Smith was originally a Congregationalist and served 2 congregational churches in New York before accepting a temporary appointment at Second Presbyterian. With the support of that congregation and the Arkansas Presbytery, he continued to serve there for more than 25 years. His major claim to fame was as a religious voice in support of teaching the theory of evolution. The Encyclopedia of Arkansas quotes him as saying, "The heresy of today is the orthodoxy of tomorrow." You can see why the Unitarians thought there was no hope. He stole our lines. I'll come back to that story later this month. This morning, I want to share part of the backstory of these local events. The relationship between the Presbyterian and Congregationalist denominations in the antebellum period and how they played out and resulted in establishing First Unitarian Universalist Church in New Orleans. Both American Unitarianism and Theodore Clapp were formed in Congregationalist circles. In the Connecticut River Valley, where Clapp was born, as well as at the schools where he studied, Calvinists and Congregationalists predominated. During Clapp's childhood, the Congregationalists and Presbyterians adopted what they called a plan of union in order to cooperate in evangelizing the American Southwest, at that time, the lower Mississippi Valley. The Presbyterians brought organizing capacity to this effort. The Congregationalists contributed its surplus of ministers. So when he graduated from seminary, Clapp went west, as so many of New England's young ministers were doing, first to Kentucky, where he taught school and occasionally had opportunities to preach. Kentucky was then the gateway to the West. In the Presbyterian Church, all the territory south of the Ohio River and west of Georgia belonged to the Kentucky Synod. It's a big area. Gradually, smaller territories called presbyteries were carved out within the Synod. At the time Theodore Clapp arrived in New Orleans, First Presbyterian Church belonged to the Mississippi Presbytery. In the Presbyterian system, when a minister has to be accepted, the minister has to be accepted not only by the congregation, but also by the leaders of the presbytery. There's a gate there. Clapp was accepted by the presbytery late in 1823 and attended his first presbytery meeting the following spring. He was appointed to chair a committee to prepare a report on the education of poor and pious young men for the ministry. During the early years of his ministry in New Orleans, the huge Kentucky Synod was gradually reorganized into smaller synods. So the Mississippi Presbytery, which included New Orleans and adjacent parts of Louisiana, formed within the Kentucky Synod, soon found itself in the smaller Synod of Mississippi and Alabama. As this reorganization went forward, more theologically conservative leaders gained a majority in the presbytery and agitated for doctrinal fidelity and purity. Toward that end, during Clapp's third year in New Orleans, they ordered copies of the Presbyterian Westminster Confession distributed to all the churches. As Congregationalist churches were organized and admitted to the presbytery, as was the reason for the plan of union, and these Congregationalist churches encountered this pressure in the form of, here's the Presbyterian doctrine, they began to agitate against the plan of union. Now, against this backdrop of church politics, in his 10th year in New Orleans, Theodore Clapp found himself on trial for heresy. His trial dragged on through 1832 and 1833. All the accounts I have read notice something seemingly political, a bit slippery, about the way Clapp accounted for himself. Little is said in those accounts about what he was up against. For one thing, he was up against himself. This was his first pastorate, and he was learning the role and what others expected of him. Early on, he had to learn that if he and his parishioners disagreed, if his views were not the same as theirs, or theirs were not the same as his, he nevertheless had to regard and treat them with love and respect. He couldn't let that disagreement get in the way of his loving relationship to his congregation. One of those parishioners, Alfred Hennon, the president of the Louisiana Bible Society and Bethel Union, complained that Clapp had slandered him. Prolonged and no doubt painful conversations resulted in a resolution where the session of the church, that's the board in our system, but they called theirs the session decided that Clapp was not guilty of misconduct, and Hennon accepted their decision. The evidence suggests that Clapp learned his lesson. Not only did he last 35 years as minister of that church, but 20 years later, he still referenced this incident in a sermon titled A Discourse on Hell. When he told his congregation, "You threw over me the aegis of your protection in the dark hour of peril, and bade me speak the truth without fear, only forbearing the indulgence of any feelings or passions toward those who differed from me in opinion, inconsistent with the divine principle of love." So he learned that lesson, but he was also up against some really rancorous church politics. And those like Mr. Hennon, whose feelings he had hurt, became partisans working against him. One church member, a physician named John Rawlins, avoided coming to church for 2 years. When the session asked him about his commitment to the church, he explained that he stayed away because Reverend Clapp preached against the fundamental articles of the Presbyterian Confession of Faith. It also emerged that he objected that Clapp, as president of the College of Orleans, had permitted 2 Negro balls at the college. This matter went all the way to the Mississippi Presbytery, where Clapp was cleared of charges of heresy and misconduct, and Rawlins agreed to become active in the church again. But when he did, continued to agitate against Clapp. Now, the congregation then had only about 40 members. And as you can imagine, church life became filled with drama and hurt feelings. Rawlins brought new charges of doctrinal irregularity, and Clapp was suspended from the church. This time, the conflict escalated to the Presbyterian General Assembly, the national body, which after 2 years ruled him restored to the privileges of the church. But his congregation's session did not recognize that ruling for another 2 years. So his suspension lasted 4 years, from 1828 till 1832. Throughout this strife, with support in the church shaky, he strove to keep the support of the Mississippi Presbytery. But the same divisions were in play there. The Presbyterian hardline conservatives didn't want a Congregationalist in their ranks. That's how the heresy trial came about, with the result that Clapp was ejected from the presbytery. As the trial began in early 1832, the conflict in the church came to a head. 15 members asked to be dismissed from membership so that they could form a new church that would conform to Presbyterian doctrine. They withdrew and refounded First Presbyterian Church, establishing their first worship space in a warehouse on Lafayette Square, where they later built a sanctuary. When the presbytery ejected Clapp, he came home and offered to resign. But he had come home to a different congregation now that the agitators had departed. Instead, the church followed him out of the presbytery, at first calling itself First Congregational Church, and then later, when the American Unitarian Association offered to list his church in their directory, First Unitarian Congregational Church. So now, Clapp, a Congregationalist, served a church with Presbyterian origins affiliated with the American Unitarian Association, whose building was owned by a Jewish benefactor, and he preached universal salvation. How's that for interfaith cooperation? Now, about his preaching universal salvation. One of the slippery things in Clapp's writings is his account of his theological conversion to universalism. Many people do not experience a straight road in their thinking about religion. People change their mind, go back and forth, and sometimes find their conscience at odds with socially accepted or preferred ideas or with church authorities. Early on in the controversies that led to his heresy trial, Clapp said that he would yield to no one in his Calvinist orthodoxy. Later, he wrote a letter to the presbytery saying that he couldn't find and despaired of finding anything in the Bible that proved the distinguishing tenets of Calvinism. The opposite. Subsequently, he wrote to the presbytery that letter no longer reflected his views, and he fully subscribed to the Westminster Confession, which was their thing. Did he go back and forth in his thinking? He tells no such story in his autobiography, but then we might expect that. As any of us make meaning of our lives and values and beliefs, we normally construct a story with a straight road in it, whether we experienced one or not, because that straight road is useful to us now. Clapp wrote that as a child, he was pained by what he called Calvinism's hatred of man, and that he began to doubt Calvinism about a year or two into his ministry in New Orleans. He famously told the story that he became convinced of universalism while reflecting on the joy he saw and felt at a New Orleans party. That, I think, was part of the sermon St. Amant referred to rather delicately in the reading. He records that he searched the scriptures and found no support for Calvinism and every support for universalism. Certainly, the more fastidious Calvinists in his congregation noticed differences between his sermons and the customary expressions of Calvinist doctrine. I expect there were a variety of external pressures on Theodore Clapp. In general, Presbyterians favored order and authority, and not just in the church. In the South, they did tend to be pro-slavery. And they recognized that their Congregationalist partners in the Plan of Union favored an anti-authoritarian form of church governance. Under congregational polity, congregations are independent, so they couldn't help but see Clapp as at best an opponent, at worst an enemy. Only 4 years after he was expelled from the Mississippi Presbytery, the Presbyterian Church, the National Church, split over slavery, the first denomination to do so. The conservatives withdrew and formed a separate Southern denomination. The New Orleans Church, after the stalwarts left, became known as Mr. Clapp's Church and as the Strangers' Church because it became the church that folks from out of town flocked to on Sunday to hear this unusual preacher. And the new First Presbyterian Church became a pro-slavery conservative bastion. When the Civil War came, the Southern Church renamed itself the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America, and afterward became the Presbyterian Church in the United States, as distinct from the Northern Church, the United Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. And it remained a separate denomination until 1983. It seems clear that most members of Clapp's church also supported slavery and felt that black folks were inferior. Clapp himself preached a defense of slavery in 1838, the year after the Presbyterian split. His defense of slavery is typical of pro-union Southerners. He went through the paces of arguing that slavery does not conflict with the moral systems of the Old and New Testaments, which every pulpit defender of slavery was obliged to do. And then he argued that in a free constitutional republic like the United States, slavery was safe, a tepid reassurance against widespread fears of slave revolt. There had been a major uprising in Louisiana back in 1811. He said that a free government would work out cures for slavery's evils, that the people will recognize evil and abandon it. He cited the famous Unitarian Reverend William Ellery Channing, who supported retaining slavery until there was a comprehensive emancipation plan for the good of the enslaved people and for public order. Those were Channing's reasons. Clapp described the threat to public order, quoting from a traveler's writings. Get ready for this. The wild African is the child of passion, unaided by one ray of religion or morality to direct his course. Wow. Clapp himself owned an enslaved man and made him work in the church. He likely did it for the enslaved man's own good, with moral uplift in mind. I don't mean to apologize for him, but rather to convey that his sympathy for slaves was in the mold of the SPCA. Slaves were considered livestock by many of the merchants and traders in his pews. In his defense of slavery, he was speaking in favor of the humane treatment of animals. For whatever reasons, that was as far as he took his sympathy. And today, of course, we're circling back to the animals and asking if that level of sympathy was even right for them. 10 years later, in his discourse on hell, Clapp spoke of hell as the brand and stigma which licentiousness stamps on the heart, the emotions of a narrow, envious, and malevolent mind, the business of trying to build oneself upon the ruins of others. I once took the tour of the Laura plantation near New Orleans. The guide told us that Laura LeCoul, the last member of the original family of owners, sold it because she had seen what the condition of being a master did to her family, how it brought out the cruelty and vice in them, and she wanted no more of it. She recalled her grandmother talking about her crop of slaves and told a story about how her grandmother had tried to sell an infant child of one of their enslaved women to passing slave traders, and her father had intervened. She did not want to become like her grandmother. I have to think that that's the hell Clapp had in mind. He spoke of the restlessness of an unsatisfied and desolate soul, the darkness of an intellect estranged and alienated, and the sharp, piercing stings of an accusing conscience. Surely this describes the inner state of many in the slaveholding class who tried hard to reconcile themselves to the notion of being a good master. If Theodore Clapp did, as he claimed, begin his journey to universalism early in his ministry, the evidence I see suggests strongly that he did so to work out the lesson of his early conflict with Alfred Hennon about forbearing the indulgence of any feelings or passions inconsistent with the divine principle of love. It looks to me as though he was working out that lesson as a practical system, a way of life, a way of moving and being in the world. It seems to me likely that though sharing with his parishioners the common prejudice that Africans were inferior, he nevertheless sought to apply the divine principle of love in his relationships with them. Perhaps it looked and felt a bit more like the prevention of cruelty to animals than we would like. To us, that falls quite a bit short of the divine principle of love. Still, even falling so short, it does appear that Theodore Clapp was leaning in the right direction, bending toward justice even when he and his people were so very far from reaching it. And so it may be with us. Political and economic institutions tug and toss at us. Networks of power and privilege shape our lives, and having to survive within such systems, we too may hold many unexamined beliefs, adhere to conventions of our time as survival mechanisms that serve our needs. Little by little, we discover the contradictions they harbor. We encounter the pain of heart and sting of conscience and the restlessness and motive force of memory. Gender is not a binary. Corporations are not people. Police sometimes do act unjustly. White, dominant, patriarchal, heteronormative, intersecting systems of oppression are real. The planet is finite, and global warming is real. As these mysteries unfold for us, may we too bend toward justice, however far from it we may be, and however obvious our shortcomings will appear to future generations. And may we invite our neighbors, especially those with whom we disagree as constructively as we can, to bend with us toward justice. So may it be. Amen.
Please remain standing as I invite David McCullough back up to extinguish our chalice as we say our closing words together. Go out into the world in peace. Have courage. Hold on to what is good. Return to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the suffering. Honor all beings.
And laissez les bons temps rouler.
Yeah, Mark, little bit of soda, Northern Dash, the Gouvet Chevrolet.